Madeleine Solomons was a flight attendant. She is now working in aeronautics while resuming studies in aviation history. Today, she speaks about Imperial Airways, a British airline from the 20s and the 30s. She puts the emphasis on the place of women in this airline.
Hello and welcome to this conference on Imperial Airways. Now this is mainly an introduction to the history of Imperial Airways. So we're going to start now. What we'll do during this conference is we will talk about the early days, so civil aviation before Imperial Airways. Then we will talk about the birth of Imperial Airways, and we'll finish by talking about women within that airline, within Imperial Airways. Now, Imperial Airways, so Imperial Airways was an airline that was founded actually in 1924. But what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the early days. And actually, Imperial Airways was founded. It's actually 4 airlines that were incorporated to create Imperial Airways. There was British Marine Air Navigation, Daimler Airway, Handley Page Transport, and Instone Airline. Now, the first one, British Marine Air Navigation. So that was a very short-lived company. It existed from 1923 to 1924. And I found it quite difficult to find images and posters advertising this airline, hence why it's been left blank here. So next we're going to talk about Daimler Airway. So Daimler Airway, here we have a picture for their timetable, for example. Then we will go through to Handley Page Transport. Handley Page, they were founded in 1919. And then we'll go to the Instone Airline. And they were an airline, they were founded in 1919 as well. So these are the 4 major airlines that came to create Imperial Airways on the 31st of March 1924. Now we're going to talk about the birth of Imperial Airways. Now, Imperial Airways, so it's early British commercial long range. It's an air transport company. They operated from 1924 to 1939, and they served parts of Europe, and they principally served the British Empire. Now, what's interesting is mainly from 1924 to 1926, they focused mainly on European travel. And it's really in 1926, they started to expand their air routes and really focus on what was called the British Empire at that time. All their colonial routes. So when it was first founded, there were a few disputes. Now, the airline was founded on the 31st of March 1924, and the first flight was actually on in April, on the 26th of April 1924. Now, what you've got here is I've got 2 pictures of 2 pilots that were part of the first 16 original Imperial Airways pilots. We have Captain Bailey and we have Captain Horsey. And basically, the reason there were disputes with these pilots is because they didn't agree on pay, they didn't agree on hours with the regular services. And from the sources that I've found and what I've read in newspapers from the day, is that they didn't think that Imperial Airways was always very honest with them from the start. So there was a bit of a mistrust. Now, below the pictures, there's a cutting from an article which was in Flight magazine. So it was from the 8th of May, 1924. And you can see that it says Imperial Airways, at long last, a settlement has come to the regrettable dispute between the newly formed Imperial Airways and the pilots and ground staff of the old absorbed airline companies. So those were the ones that I previously talked about. So on May 2nd, there was a statement that was issued, and they're happy to say that an agreement has been reached between the pilots, the mechanics, the ground staff, and that services will resume on the 5th of May. And you can see that it's understood that one of the most principal points of the agreement is the creation of a new post, the air superintendent. which has been newly appointed. So it's interesting to see how it all started. So now we're going to talk about the first flight. So the first flight was between the Croydon Aerodrome and the airport of Paris Le Bourget. It was on the 26th of April in 1924. And you can see here that we have a map. So we have the Imperial Airways London Paris map. And then you can see a little bit of advertisement here for Shell, saying Shell are the sole suppliers of petrol to Imperial Airways. Now, I haven't quite found the exact date of this map, and I'm still looking. But in my research, I found that generally before 1926, Imperial Airways didn't actually use maps when they were advertising their routes. And it's really after 1926, probably when they started focusing more on air routes around the British Empire, that they really started showing maps of the routes and where they were going. So that is the first flight. So which leads us to Croydon Airport. So Croydon Airport was actually inaugurated in 1928, in May 1928, and it's really the base for Imperial Airways. Now, what I've got here is on your right, you can see a cutting from a magazine. It's actually from the American City magazine. And basically, this magazine, there's a short article about the Croydon airfield, how it's designed, and how American airlines airfields should focus on the design of the airports, because it's something new, and suddenly the air travel, more people want to travel, so we need to build more airports across the world. And in the US, they're talking about the Croydon airfield and the redesign of the aerodrome. So the whole article is actually about it. What I find interesting is they're talking about the Croydon aerodrome has some errors, such as passengers having to travel too far to get from the aerodrome to the field to get onto the plane. That's quite interesting to read, and that's from 1926. Now, here we have a cutting from the Flight magazine again. I've got a lot of my sources from there. So this is from May 10th, 1928. And here we have an article called Croydon Airport Formally Opened. So this is by Lady Maud. She opened the airport with her husband, Sir Samuel, who was the Air Minister at the time. He was the Air Minister from, it started in 1922. So they formally opened their airport. Then here we have a map of Croydon Airport. So we actually have two maps. So we have an aerial view here, especially on the one on the right. And then you can really see the little tower here, which is the most recognizable part of Croydon Airport. So now we're going to talk about the aircraft. So the main aircraft that were used by Imperial Airways were what we called Handley Page aircraft. And then you can see Croydon Airport is just here. You can see it in the background. And then here you can see Lady Maud, the Air Minister's wife again, who is christening an aircraft. So what's interesting about these flying machines, these aircraft in those days, is that Handley Page used to be commonly used for every single aircraft that you would see. So if you saw a flying machine, you would say, oh, look, there's a Handley Page in the air, even if it wasn't necessarily one. So now we're going to talk about different routes where they were flying. So they were flying to Europe. Here, the Imperial Airways actually started the first winter sports service to Bâle in Switzerland. And you can see women here getting ready to go on the plane with their skis, ready to go on holiday and going there by plane. Then talking about women getting on the plane. So when people used to travel in those days, we had to weigh everyone. You couldn't say, oh, I guess that person, us, will say for women, we take that weight, for men, we take that weight. We had to weigh everyone. So they had a card. And for women in those days, they actually had a separate room in Croydon Airport where they would take the women and weigh them. So you wouldn't weigh them in front of their husbands, which I thought was quite interesting when it comes to the whole boarding. Then we are now going to talk about the cockpit crew, so the flying, the captains, the co-pilots, the navigators. So their average salary was around £800 a year, which when I say in today's money, that was based on a calculation made in 2016. So it says £43,600. It's actually, if you count inflation, it's actually a lot more than that. But coming back to the disputes that we were talking about previously, some of the pilots in the former airlines that then made Imperial Airways were actually earning more. So I say this is an average, but some of them earn more or less. And then here, the aircraft they're standing in front of is actually a Handley page. So cabin crew. When I first started doing research into Imperial Airways, what really drew me to it is I wanted to focus on cabin crew. I wanted to focus on the development of cabin crew and especially women. So I was hoping or thinking that I would be talking about the first flight attendants working for Imperial Airways. Not at all. The first cabin crew for Imperial Airways, they were recruited in 1924, and it was only men. Most of the time it was young men. Now, Imperial Airways isn't actually the first airline, British airline, to have done that. Actually, Daimler Airway, they were the first to employ what we called cabin boys. And they did that in 1922. And there were 3 young boys who were 14 who would be cabin boys. The first one, the first actual cabin boy was called Jack Sanderson. He was 14 and he was employed in 1922. Unfortunately, he died in September 1923 when the aircraft crashed. The reason they employed men in those days is because for the airlines, they would sometimes fly very, very far. There would be lots of stops. And basically, they wanted someone that didn't weigh a lot, that was strong, and that could easily get all the luggage and put it in the aircraft, who could sometimes even get out of the aircraft and push it. For example, if they landed in a desert in sand, he could get out and help push the aircraft. So that was the main reason why they chose to have men on board and not women. Now, so that was mainly for the cabin crew, and it was the cabin boys working for Imperial Airways. So Imperial Airways, so it's a company of first. So Imperial Airways opened some of the first air routes towards the British Empire. And here we have a map of all the different routes and the different aircraft, the flying personnel, and then the ground personnel as well. Because you would have different airports, you couldn't just fly from the UK to Australia in one go. You would have to stop at different airports, and you would always have Imperial Airways ground staff in these different airports. So as I was saying earlier, so there's the development of routes, Europe, the colonial empire. Here we have another map for Imperial Airways with all the empire and all the European routes. Here are the Imperial routes, and then we talk about associated companies as well, because it wasn't just Imperial Airways, there are also local companies as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So here we have an image from the Illustrated London News. So it's an advert from the 2nd of July, 1932. And what I find interesting in this advert is they're trying to sell that the luxury is not that expensive. It was in those days, but they want more people to travel. And they're also saying you can send mail and freight. So now we will go on to Imperial Air routes. So as I was saying earlier, for example, to go to Australia, it will take you 10 days. If you wanted to fly to the Cape, that would be 9 days to get there. And then you have different stopovers. You have London, you have Nairobi, you have Johannesburg, Cape Town. So the different types of aircraft, so they had a fleet of land planes and seaplanes. So the main land planes were Handley Pages, and then the main seaplanes were the short C-class aircraft. So they're massive aircrafts, flying boats, as they are advertised. So here we have a close-up of a Handley Page, or as we were saying, all large aircraft are known as Handley Pages. And you can see that the cabin inside is there's lots of room, it's quite comfortable. Here we have more so Handley Pages. Once again, you have an image that I previously showed with Lady Maud, who's currently christening this aircraft. And then here we have an article from the Cheltenham Chronicle and the Gloucestershire Graphic. So it's Saturday, so it's from the 20s, and you can see people looking at the aircraft flying in the air. And then now we're going to talk about the development of flight experience and air travel. So one of the main developments that Imperial Airways introduced was the Silver Wing Deluxe flight experience. So that was first introduced on the 1st of May 1927 on the Argosy planes, and it was a flight experience between London and Paris. Now, you can see the inside of the aircraft just here. So for those days, that was a very comfortable aircraft. And this is actually, the image that you can see on the right is actually circa 1933, and it's actually one of the renovated interiors of the first aircraft that flew this Silver Wing line. You can see the cabin boy here. You can see he's standing next to the drinks cabinet. And then you can see the comfortable seats. And you can see that it matches the seats and the design that you have on your left. So now we're going to talk about the short C-class, so the flying boats. These were very large aircraft. It was mainly for comfort for the passengers here. And then you could do lots of things in these sorts of boats. You could even play golf, for example. So sorry, I went a little bit too far, but that's okay. So just talking about comfort and cabin. So you can see the cabin of the early Imperial Airways aircraft where you've just got wicker seats. That was in 1924, 1925. And then you can see that in the 30s, we're going towards more comfortable seats. And these were the type of seats that you would find in the short C-class boats. So talking about flight experience and air travel, so you can see on the image on the left, you can see a person is actually playing golf inside the aircraft. And then you can see here on the image on the right, so this is in a short C-class. This is in the Kent, so it's a short S-17 Kent C-class. And what's interesting is if you look at that image on the right, you can see there's actually a map just here. So I don't know if you can see my mouse, but you can see there's a map here. And then you can also see here, you have the altitude and the flight speed as well for the aircraft. So the passengers can actually see how high they're flying and how fast they're flying. And I thought that was really interesting to find that in aircraft in those days. So now we'll just talk about ads. So I have been showing you lots of pictures, lots of adverts. And what Imperial Airways really likes to focus on in their adverts, by looking at many of them and analysing them, is they like to talk about comfort and reliability. They're kind of like two main pillars. So you can see comfort in the air, you can see the cabin boy doing the service, and then here we have reliability, and you can see a strong lion below it. So then I just wanted to talk about in-flight entertainment as well. I think this is really interesting because Imperial Airways was one of the first airlines to actually show an in-flight movie, an in-flight film, and that was on the 6th of April, 1925. So you can see there are people in this image here that are loading a projector on board. And the film that they showed was actually The Lost World. Now here you can see inside the cabin, so you can see it is one of their earliest aircraft from this was in 1925, so you can still see they've got the wicker chairs, but they can watch a silent movie, and that's not a problem because the cabins were so loud. So people are focusing on a film rather than maybe worrying about what's below them or about the noise. So that was about the first in-flight entertainment. And now we are going to talk about women within Imperial Airways. So I tried to do a lot of research. However, it was quite difficult to find a lot of information about women within Imperial Airways because the honest thing is that there weren't actually that many working within Imperial Airways. So I'm going to be talking about women that are sort of gravitating around it or that have promoted it in a certain way. So here we have like how I would consider it like the 20s, the 30s is really the early golden age of aviation, where we can see an increase in passenger demand. So here we have an aircraft, the Horatius from Imperial Airways, and you can see quite a lot of women who are ready to go away on holidays. So either they're just about to leave or they are arriving. I'm still trying to dig in and find a lot more information about that picture to try and figure out who these women are, where they were going. I can pinpoint the time because I have the name and the registration of the aircraft, but it's still not that easy. So what I'll talk about also is the Imperial Airways Gazette. So that's really interesting. So that was a magazine that was for the workers of Imperial Airways. The Imperial Airways Gazette, most of them are stocked at the British Airways Heritage Museum. So I'm going to go and do a bit of research when we can travel again and try and look into that. What I find really interesting in this front page of this magazine to the Imperial Airways Gazette is you can see it's from June 1936. You can see women appearing on the front cover. So it's interesting to understand why they're starting to show women on the front cover. And what's also interesting is you can see the Speedbird logo that's just up here. Now the Speedbird logo, they only really started to use it on planes in 1939. So it's interesting to see it here 3 years previously before it was first used on planes on the front cover of this magazine. That's what I'll be looking into a little bit more. And then women within Imperial Airways, their role in the development of British Airlines. So here you can see a woman who's ready to travel. This was taken in the 20s and it was actually at Le Bourget. You can see written down here on the picture, you can just about see Le Bourget at the bottom. In the middle, you can see that she's wearing flying clothes. Now, what was interesting is how it also influenced women's fashion in the 20s and 30s, like the type of clothes that they could take with them. I mean, when women were flying from the UK and they were flying all the way to Australia, for example, they had to take enough clothes for all these stopovers and all these nights spent in hotels. And in those days, there were certain dress codes. So you couldn't just walk into these hotels wearing the flying clothes or the coat that you can see on this woman. So they had to have all of their ball gowns ready and prepared when they landed at these different hotels. So it was interesting to see how they had to learn to pack in a new way. And that was mainly Lady Maud, who was the wife of the British Air Minister at the time. Now, she was on the first inaugural flight to Delhi in India with her husband, and she was actually awarded a DBE because she had travelled over 12,000 miles. She was one of the first women to actually travel so many miles in the aircraft because she basically went everywhere with her husband. And I think she's quite an interesting personality and person to look into. She inaugurated the Croydon Airport. She also inaugurated the Cranwell Cadets Flying Academy. It's very interesting to see how she loved flying, how she liked traveling, and her sort of part in Imperial Airways and kind of promoting it and promoting this airline across the empire. So I'll be looking into a bit more of that as well. And then I just want to talk about British women. So from the 1910s, 1930s, this is more a sort of like a context. So in 1914, there was one of the first articles was in Flight about women aviators, women in flight. Women during World War I, women had replaced men in employment. During World War I, there were 24% of women employed in 1914. And then we had 37% that were employed in 1918. In 1918, women were granted partial voting rights. That means they had to be over 30 if they were a householder or a graduate. Women's rights and status in society is on the rise, if you say it in those days. In 1922, the International Commission for Air Navigation, they started to discuss women's role in civil aviation, but they started to discuss saying, oh, can they hold a pilot's license? Can they hold this? Can they do that? So there were certain discussions. In 1928 in the UK, there were equal voting rights. But from the research, the women's role in the 1930s civil aviation is quite limited. From the information that I currently have, but I will be looking more into that, and especially looking at the British Overseas Aircraft Corporation, which is also some of my research. I'm going to be focusing on women flight attendants and roles that they took on then. So we've come to an end of this sort of like introduction to Imperial Airways. So Imperial Airways was founded in 1924. It ceased operating in 1939. So it was really the interwar period British airline. And then we talked a little bit about women within it, but I will be looking more into that. So this is it for this presentation. Thank you, and merci, and let me know if you have any questions.